Welcome to Wednesday Night Bible Study. Grab your pen, paper, and the word, and let's dive in.
Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Tonight we'll be talking about Paul's letters, and basically we'll be doing an overview of Paul's letters. The context, the first one is in 1 Timothy. Paul wrote 1 Timothy to provide guidance and encouragement to Timothy as he led the church in Ephesus, addressing issues of church organization, leadership, and combating false teachers. The context of the letter in 1 Timothy is one of the pastoral epistles written by the Apostle Paul to his young colleague, Timothy, who was overseeing the church in Ephesus. Paul likely wrote the letter around AD 63 after his release from imprisonment in Rome, during a time when he was concerned about the challenges Timothy faced in his ministry. First of all, he was encouraging and giving guidance to Paul to encourage Timothy in his responsibility as a church leader. He provided practical advice on how to manage church affairs, ordain leaders, and maintain sound doctrine. And then he was addressing false teaching. A significant concern in the letter is the presence of false teachers in the church. Paul instructs Timothy to confront these false teaching, which included incorrect interpretation of the law and practices that discourage marriage and certain foods. And then he wrote about establishing church order. The letter served as a manual for church organizations, detailing the qualification for church leaders, such as elders and deacons, and emphasizing the importance of living a life that reflects the teaching of the gospel. The key theme was faithfulness to the gospel. Paul stressed that true faith must result in godly living, and he warns against the dangers of staying from sound doctrine. And then Paul wrote about the roles of women in the church. The letter includes instructions regarding the roles of men and women in worship and leadership, reflecting cultural context of the time. Paul also encouraged Paul to persevere. Paul encouraged Timothy to remain steadfast in his faith and to fulfill his ministry despite challenges, emphasizing the importance of prayer and public worship. In summary, Paul wrote 1 Timothy to equip Timothy with the necessary tools and knowledge to lead effectively, safeguard the church against false teaching, and promote a healthy church environment in Ephesus. And then we're going to go to 2 Timothy, which Paul wrote letters also. It's traditionally considered a personal letter from Paul to Timothy near the end of Paul's life. Traditional view, according to the traditional Christian teaching, Paul wrote 2 Timothy to Timothy, a young pastor, and his spiritual son while Paul was in prison in Rome near the end of his life, around 66 to 67 AD, under Emperor Nero. The letter is highly personal, offering encouragement, guidance, and warning about false teaching. Paul reflects on his life, expresses his impending death, and urges Timothy to remain steadfast in the faith and ministry. The style is intimate and pastoral, resembling a father speaking to his son. The historical contents of Paul's letter. Paul's second imprisonment was harsher than his earlier house arrest, and he faced isolation and persecution. In 2 Timothy, he requests Timothy bring personal items like his cloak and his scroll, highlighting the difficult conditions of his confinement. The letter also serves as a final charge to Timothy, passing on the mission of preaching the gospel and maintaining sound doctrine. While the tradition view affirms Paul's authorship, some modern scholars argue that 2 Timothy, along with other personal epistles, may have been written by the following of Paul after his death, possibly between AD 90 and 100 and 140. The scholars note different in the style of vocabulary and church structures compared to Paul's earlier letters. In conclusion, the most historical and religious source affirm that Paul wrote 2 Timothy to Timothy, making it a deeply personal and instructive letter. It reflects Paul's concern for Timothy's faithfulness and continuation of ministry and perseverance amid persecution, whether written directly by Paul or by close followers familiar with his final days. The next letter, we're going to go to Titus. Paul wrote the epistle of Titus to guide and encourage his close companions to follow workers in the gospel. Titus, who had been instructed with leading the church on the island of Crete. Titus was a fellow believer and co-worker of Paul, likely converted under his ministry. Paul valued him highly, calling him my true son in the common faith. During missionary journeys, Titus accompanied him and was sent to Corinth to help reconcile the church there. The situation in Crete, after Paul's third missionary journey, he left Titus in Crete to organize and to lead the churches there. You can go to Acts 21 through 23. By the time Paul wrote, Titus had been there for some time, but the church was still in its early stages and facing challenges. The reason Paul was writing he wrote because he gave him leadership instructions. Paul directed Titus to appoint worthy elders in every town, setting clear qualification for church leaders. That's in Titus 1, 5 through 9. Also, he was combating false teaching. False teachers were already present, promoting Jewish myths and teaching from the circumcision party. That's Titus 1, 10 through 14. Paul urges Titus to teach sound doctrines and to rebuke error family. Titus 1, 10 through 16, Titus 3, 9 through 11. Paul also emphasized the gospel produces godliness in everyday life, even in a moral, challenging environment like Crete. Paul also invited Titus to return and visit for a visit, showing ongoing personal and spiritual support. The purpose and theme of this was the letter central theme is the inseparable of faith and practice. Belief must be matched by good works. Titus 1:1, Titus 2:1, Titus 3:4-7. Paul's goals was to ensure Titus could lead the Crete church with doctrinal purity, moral integrity, and a clear gospel message. In short, Paul wrote to Titus to equip him with leadership, protect the church from false teaching, and encourage him personally, all rooted in the transformation power of the gospel. And the last one we'll talk about is Philemon. Some pronounce it Philemon, but we go to Philemon, where Paul wrote to Philemon. Paul wrote a short New Testament letter to Philemon primarily to secure and return of Onesimus, a runaway slave who had fled from Philemon's household and found refuge with Paul in Rome. Onesimus had become a Christian through Paul's ministry. That's in Philemon's 10. And Paul asked Philemon to receive him not as a slave, but as a beloved brother in Christ. Philemon was a wealthy Christian in Colossae who hosted the local church in his home. Onesimus had stolen from Philemon and escaped, likely during Paul's ministry in Ephesus. Paul's writing from prison requests for Philemon to welcome Onesimus back, even if he had wronged him, and to treat him as a brother rather than property. To model Christian fellowship by asking Philemon to forgive and accept Onesimus, Paul emphasizes that in Christ, social and legal distinctions like slavery should not divide people. To strengthen the Colossian church, the letter was also addressed to the church in Philemon's home, encouraging unity and mutual respect among believers. While Paul did not especially call for the abolition of slavery, he challenged the moral and social norms of the time by insisting on treating a slave as a fellow believer, and subtly laid the groundwork for a new ethical relationship between master and slave within the Christian community, where love and forgiveness supersede legal status. In short, Paul wrote to Philemon to restore Onesimus to his master household as a Christian brother, using the opportunity to teach about reconciliation, forgiveness, and the transformative power of the gospel in reshaping human relationship. So that's our teaching on Paul's letter. Thank you for joining us on tonight.